Hello, I'm Perrin Beatty, President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and welcome to the Business of Business. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, we'll be having a series of conversations with experts, with government officials, with business leaders about the impact of the pandemic on Canadian business. There's probably no other sector that has been more hard hit by COVID-19 than travel and tourism, which is absolutely vital to the economy of every single region of Canada. It was the sector that was the first to feel the effects of the pandemic, and it will likely be the last to recover. Now, our guest today is perhaps better qualified than anyone else in Canada to explain how the sector has been affected. Born in Bucharest, Romania, Calin Rovinescu came to Canada at the age of 5. He's a graduate of McGill University, was trained as a lawyer, and after many years as a successful lawyer, he came to Air Canada. It may have seemed appropriate that when Calin took over the job as President and CEO of Air Canada, it was on April Fool's Day in 2009 at the height of the economic crisis. At that time, the airline faced enormous challenges. However, in the decade that followed, Calin turned Air Canada into one of the 20 largest airlines in the world, serving nearly 220 airports on 6 continents. In 2018, the company served over 50 million customers, and last November, the Report on Business named Calin Canada's CEO of the Year for the 2nd time, as it saluted his extraordinary leadership of Air Canada. Calin, welcome to the Business of Business.
Thank you very much, Perrin. It's a pleasure to do this with you, and thank you for the opportunity.
In the short time that we have, I'd like to touch on how Air Canada and the sector have been affected by the pandemic and get a sense as to how you see the industry evolving. And I'd also like to get a sense as to how you see the landscape in general evolving and how other countries are helping their airline sectors to respond, and what you feel that Canada should be doing to help our sector here in this country. Let's start with where we find ourselves today. It's a very different world from the one that we thought we were living in at the beginning of January. How has Air Canada been affected?
So there's no other word to describe what we have seen thus far other than catastrophic, cataclysmic. This is materially worse than, I would say, the combined effect of 9/11. And of course, we know how catastrophic 9/11 was for the airline sector. SARS, which of course, in Toronto and Hong Kong in particular, SARS had a disproportionate effect on airlines, and the global financial crisis. I'd say, this is several factors greater than all of those 3 combined. We've seen a complete deterioration of airline revenues globally. The industry losses that IATA is predicting for the year, $84 billion of industry losses. Passenger revenue losses of $371 billion US. And so the numbers are just staggering beyond description. The expectation is that 25 million jobs in the sector are at risk. About 1/3 of all airline jobs are at risk. So this has been something that has affected this industry much more than any other. And Air Canada, because of the enormous success we've had over the previous decade and the growth of our connecting traffic and the building out of 3 global hubs in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, we've been actually very severely affected because, of course, there is no connecting traffic. There is no international traffic. And maybe we'll come back to this later. And then the very onerous restrictions that have been imposed by governments in terms of quarantine and border restrictions, make it virtually impossible to operate at this time. So I would say that we're living in the worst time ever in the history of commercial aviation. So how's that for a start, Perrin?
It's not a happy way to begin. In comparing the challenges that Air Canada faces, how does this compare with the airline sector in the rest of the world? You cited some statistics about the gross effects. Are you affected roughly in the same way as others, or is it more severe in Canada, or is it less severe?
I would say right now it's more severe in Canada, and really for 3 reasons. One is the geography of Canada. So Canada, of course, as a country with a small population and a large geographic mass, means that you actually have very thin markets. And so what we've managed to do successfully is to build our business a lot on international travel. So we actually count on international travel more than, say, a domestic US carrier would, where you have a very, very large domestic US market, or a European carrier where you have a very large European market. And so, that is disproportionately affecting us. That's a function of geography. Secondly, the restrictions that Canada has imposed, while they were absolutely necessary in March, extremely onerous restrictions, 5 different layers of restriction. One is, of course, prohibiting any international travelers from coming into the country. Secondly, and probably the most significant, is the quarantine measure that both Canadians traveling abroad, when they come in, they have to quarantine for 14 days. And of course, any international traveler, if permitted in, would have to quarantine. And of course, that destroys all travel demand, because very few people are prepared to go for a business meeting and then have to come back and quarantine for 14 days, or even for a vacation. They can't afford to take 2 weeks holiday and then 2 weeks quarantine. And so that quarantine dynamic is very, very serious and affects us, and that's not the same in many other countries. Then, of course, we have the border closure with the U.S. as a third layer. Fourthly, some provinces have imposed their own border restrictions in terms of entering their provinces, or quarantine requirements. And to top it off, the government has a travel advisory advising against all non-essential travel, which prevents people from getting insurance and so on. So the combined effect of those 5, that is probably amongst the most onerous in the world. So that's almost like a second layer of it. And then thirdly, many governments around the world have, and we can maybe unpack this a bit afterwards, many governments around the world have introduced support programs for the industry, either financial support to compensate for this very severe loss that results in part from government closures, or to provide tax relief in some cases where there are onerous rates and charges that apply. And in Canada, we've not seen at this stage either of those 2 drivers, but I can provide a bit more visibility as to what other countries have done a bit later in this conversation.
When most Canadians think about airlines, they think about being passengers on the airlines, but they don't think in the same way about the economic impact of airlines on our economy across the country. Can you give us a sense of the economic contribution that would have been made last year by Air Canada?
No, sure. And that's one that we try to explain, quite frequently to as many intervenents as we can. So last year, Air Canada generated about $19.1 billion of revenue itself. That's the Air Canada contribution that's our total revenue. And of course, we achieved decent profitability on that revenue base. However, KPMG and other experts estimate our contribution to Canada's GDP to be at least $50 billion. And that was probably 2 years old. I think that was a 2017 study. And so we'll say, well, where does that 50 billion go? We'll talk about that in a minute. We employ about 38,000 Canadians. We also have about 6,000 additional employees at our regional subsidiaries. We support about 34,000 retirees, people who've retired from Air Canada who are still collecting pensions, and whose families count on us for that. And we support about another 190,000 jobs in spin-off industries, such as hotels, restaurants, ground transport companies, tourism. Tourism is a big driver, and maybe we'll talk about tourism afterwards. Airports, manufacturing, training, food and beverage, etc. So some of the large buckets that people can identify with, we spend about $1.9 billion in 2019 on our regional carriers that operate into smaller regional markets. Some of you may have seen, or you may have seen, Perrin, that we announced last week that we were suspending indefinitely 30 regional routes and shutting eight bases based on the current economic environment. And that had a lot of economic impact. And we obviously regret that had that impact on them. We had no choice but to start putting this as part of our cost transformation strategy. But the amount that we spend on regionals enables the regional carriers, whether they're 35-seat aircraft, 18-seat aircraft, 75-seat aircraft, go into some of these markets and obviously help develop the economy. So that's $1.9 billion on that. In terms of airport landing fees and terminal agreements and rent and so on, we spent $730 million last year. This enables airports to do their development programs. In some cases, build hotels at airports. In the case of Montreal, build the high-speed rail project. Of course, a lot of that depends on our revenue that we in turn feed the airports. Catering, about $330 million on catering. Various food and beverage companies throughout the country who support obviously all of our flights. On the manufacturing side, we're of course a big buyer of aircraft and simulators, including Canadian aircraft and simulators. And so you'll have the Airbus 220, which is the former C series. In 220 alone, we're expecting to spend about $580 million on purchasing that aircraft, and about $20 million on purchasing simulators for that aircraft from CAE. So that sort of affects other Canadian companies that are manufacturing. Maintenance activities in Canada, about $160 million per year. And then our overall tax rates and charges bill, both income taxes, payroll taxes, when we collect air traveler security surcharge for our passengers traveling, and all of the other, panoply, if you like, of taxes, including fuel taxes and so on, add up to about $1.95 billion, which of course in turn also goes into the economy. So these are just a select, a series of examples. Airlines tend to be massive economic drivers. And this is one thing that I think many countries around the world have recognized, which is why they have stepped into providing, very, very significant levels of support, for the carriers, especially for some of the so-called flag carriers in their countries. And I can go through that if you like in a few minutes.
Well, and the figures that you cite are largely figures that are direct spending. What it doesn't look at is the role of airlines and of airports as a critical part of the economic infrastructure of a community. Now, a decision by a company as to whether or not to locate a facility in a particular community could very well depend upon whether or not there is air transportation and air cargo transport available from that community. So the economic spin-offs go way beyond any direct spending as well.
No, exactly. And this is what we're seeing right now in terms of some of the reaction. Obviously, some of the communities that we've pulled out of are concerned as to what impact this will have on their communities. I mean, this has been a debate in terms of the role of airlines that's been going on, for the better part of 3 decades. As you probably know, most airlines in the world were at one point owned by governments. They were the equivalent of state-owned enterprises. And over the last 30 years, most successful airlines have been privatized and are in the private sector. And this pandemic has brought into question in many places that discussion again. And you've seen in some cases, governments in different parts of the world deciding to step into the airlines again and invest, either completely nationalize them, which I don't think is a good idea. I think it's a really bad idea personally. And been very, very few good examples of that anywhere in the world. In fact, most state-owned enterprises have gone, bankrupt and are in difficulty right now. Thai Airways, South African Airways, Alitalia, Air India. These are all really bad examples, but you do see some pockets of it. As I say, some very, very large amounts have been provided to other airlines in other countries. So we look at the United States, which of course all the airlines are in the private sector, but American Airlines, United Airlines, Delta, and Southwest each received a minimum of about $10 billion each in Canadian dollars terms, in some cases up to $14 billion of loans and support programs. In Europe, Lufthansa and Air France KLM received upwards of 10 billion euros. In Asia, airlines like Cathay Pacific and Singapore and ANA received amounts varying from $4 billion US dollars to 14 billion in the case of Singapore Airlines. Again, Singapore recognizing the important economic driver that its airline is. And so, this is something that has created a lot of dialogue internationally with very, very, very large amounts. And Canada has, to this point, taken the view that it would not have sector-specific support and has not provided any sector-specific support for this industry. That has been so far a clear pronouncement, if you like, by the government. And I don't know whether further thought is being given or will be given to understand what some of these economic benefits are from the airline industry. So we've largely had to go it alone thus far, and fortunately we had a very, very strong balance sheet coming into this pandemic, amongst the best in the world relative to our size. And so we've been able to thus far, contrary to many of these other carriers, thus far been able to do what we needed to do on our own.
I want to come back to the question of government support of the sector, both in Canada and abroad, in a minute. But let's turn for a second to Air Canada itself and how the company has been affected. One of the things that's so striking for me, both as someone who was in government all those years back when Air Canada was a Crown corporation, and following it in all of those years, is the sense of pride that there was among the employees that this was an airline that was literally on the move, that it was growing, it was successful, it was recognized. It's one of the finest airlines anywhere in the world, and that pride was palpable. And I know the personal commitment that you've had and the pride you've had in building the airline and turning it around and making it a world leader. What have been the impacts on Air Canada of this? What measures have you been forced to take? And how does that compare to where you were this time last year?
No, this is, Perrin, this is one of the most difficult topics, because it saddened me enormously of all of the different things that I've done in my career, especially after the amazing progress we've had over the decade. You mentioned one of the top 20 carriers. We're actually in the top, I think we're the 13th or 14th largest carrier in the world now in terms of what we've built up, and winning Skytrax, which is the sort of the Academy Awards of airlines for 8 of those 10 years, and being recognized as top stock on the TSX. So we did well by our shareholders, we did well by our pensioners. We eliminated the pension deficit. We went from a $4.5 billion pension deficit to a $2.5 billion pension surplus. Won customer awards, won shareholder awards. So it was an amazing time, and our employees were, so emboldened by that, and they really thought that we can take on the world. And we did very difficult decisions, and partly, because of the fact that we had to do things on our own, we had to move quickly. We're in a total free fall in terms of cash burn. We had a difficult decision on 20,000 layoffs, which is more than half of our workforce. And we did this with eyes wide open as to how long we suspected this would take for the industry to get back to 2019 levels. And we've said it's a minimum of 3 years to get back to 2019 levels. And certainly with the border closures and the quarantine provisions that are still in place, we think it could even be longer than that. And so and as each month passes, we've been very public about this. We announced this at the end of our first quarter that we were in a cash burn situation of $22 million a day, or call it nearly $700 million a month. So obviously, while we had a great balance sheet, certainly there's no balance sheet on the planet that could endure that forever. We've been very successful at raising liquidity, and believe it or not, in the last 90 days, including drawing on our lines of credit, we've raised a total of $5.5 billion of incremental liquidity, which shows the confidence that the capital markets have had in what we've been doing for the last decade. So all that to say, that the employees of Air Canada have tremendous pride. The employees of Air Canada have done everything in their power to assist here while we were repatriating Canadians from all corners of the world, and in some cases, very difficult circumstances. In Peru, Peru was shut down, and we had military operating in military airports, and so on and so forth. With literally no facilities, outdoor facilities at airports there, and trying to bring people from different parts of the country with buses, working with global affairs. We took people from Morocco, also in very difficult circumstances, where we basically had the country in complete shutdown, and operating out of China. We were the first to actually make our decision for the safety of our passengers and crew to stop serving China back in January. And we were very, very clear with the government as to we thought that there was a real risk of spread at that time, and we were the first carrier to pull out, and encourage the government to look at the Chinese carriers, and they at that stage chose to let them continue flying in. So all this to say that this has been an amazingly difficult time for our employees. They've been behind us and with us, supporting these various steps. But sadly, it's going to take a bit of time for us to be able to get back to 2019 levels, and therefore to have a workforce that'll be of that size. And this is one of the real tragedies of this environment. We've gone from what I call a very severe health crisis into a very severe economic crisis. Lots of jobs lost. Those people will have to go into different industries, and we're going to have to make some fundamental structural changes, like we did last week with the announcement of our regional routes. We have a $1.1 billion cost transformation and capital reduction program, which, for example, we talk about the C series, the A220. One of the spin-offs of this is we might have to terminate the back end of our C series 220 order. We might not be able to support that program to the same level we intended to, given the rate of closure of borders and quarantine and how long this is likely to take. So there are a lot of structural spin-off consequences to this, which, of course, we're encouraging governments and the new committee that the Minister of ISED has struck to talk about the restart. We're also ensuring that there's a clarity being brought to, some of these measures that have currently been brought in, need to now start actively supporting a restart, and not just simply, being amounts for people to stay home.
Let's turn back to the question of what sort of support you've had from governments during this. You mentioned that there has not been sector-specific support. Instead of that, the government announced the so-called LEAF program that was designed for large employers. How useful has that program been to you, and what use have you made of other government programs at the federal or provincial level?
So the only program that has been of use to us has been really for the benefit of our employees, has been the wage subsidy for employees. And so we looked at that both for the employees who were staying on and the employees who were being laid off. And at the end of the day, we couldn't make it work for the employees who were being laid off, because in addition to the cost, in addition to the amounts that are being paid to them under the subsidy, we would have had ongoing, health and benefits programs once they remained on our payroll. And we knew that there was no reasonable way we could bring them back within a short period of time. So we could really not justify having that. So we are not making use of the wage subsidy for the people who are being now on a permanent layoff basis. We are making use of it for the people who are on a recall basis or who are currently working, and that is helping. But of course, in many cases, that is, it's intending to compensate at a lower level of salary. It doesn't help with our, pilots and flight attendants and mechanics and engineers who have, much higher salaries than the wage subsidy covers. So it does help, but it is assistance for those employees. But I would say it's fairly modest and certainly not anywhere comparable to what some of our global competitors are able to benefit from in their countries.
So strategically, other countries have looked specifically at their carriers and designed programs that were intended to assist them directly.
Yes, all of those carriers that I mentioned, that I referenced earlier, all had programs specifically designed, and that's just a smattering. There are many others. Portugal has a program. Spain had a program, but basically these are programs specifically for the airline industries, given the unique impact. Like, our revenues and our operations were down 90 to 95%, in some cases 97%. No other industry. I mean, some industries of scale have been affected to the tune of 30%, 35%, 40%. But I mean, the idea that this is a cataclysmic sort of event, especially it's one of those that the larger you are, the more severe it is. So I think that's what governments elsewhere have recognized. But here we have made use of that program. The LEAF program has been characterized thus far by the government as a last resort financing. And therefore it is both expensive and I would say, at least on its face, onerous. We have not looked at it for the time being because it's been characterized as last resort. So we're trying to find our own alternatives, our own sources if we can. But of course, again, we are becoming highly uncompetitive in relation to our competitors in other countries if they receive funding at the government's cost of capital at 1% or 2%, low interest financing in many cases, or outright grants in some cases. Obviously, we become highly uncompetitive if the governments are indirectly, because we compete with all of the U.S. carriers, both for transborder traffic as well as for international. When we built these global gateways in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, part of that is to capture U.S. traffic that was otherwise connecting over one of the U.S. gateways. So we would be competing for that traffic, as well as competing for European traffic that was connecting at some place in North America to go, say, to South America. So this is competing for global traffic flows. And so when you are disadvantaged to that level, it could have a long-term consequence. It could go to the viability of those hubs, the viability of those airports, et cetera. So that is something that that we see as an impediment in terms of competitiveness for our business going forward.
Well, what then would be the one or two key things that government could do today to assist Air Canada and to assist the airline sector in Canada to be able to weather this crisis and to succeed?
Really, I'd say two main themes here. One is continuing to look at the fairness of a sectoral support that is consistent with what other countries are doing. We definitely do not want, and frankly, the expression bailout is an inappropriate expression. Air Canada had a balance sheet of $7.3 billion coming into this. We had strong profitability. We had an amazing decade. We were, coming into investment grade. And so this pandemic is not of our doing. And of course, the government shutdown of borders and quarantine restriction is not of our doing. And so the idea is we have a liquidity crisis to get through this, and other countries have understood that, a liquidity crisis to get through this. And that liquidity crisis, the idea is, call it long-term, low-interest financing akin to the government's cost of capital to get through this catastrophic environment, because in part of also all of the spin-off consequences of it. So I would hope that they would continue looking at opportunities in that space, consistent with what other countries have done. Secondly, and I'd say at this stage, almost more urgently, is at least more urgently for us, and some carriers might have a different perspective, more urgently is the ability for us to start earning some revenue. And right now, we are no longer shut down by the pandemic. We're right now in demand. We're right now shut down as a result of the government restrictions, the combination of those 5 things that I referenced, the border restrictions, and especially the quarantine. And what's gone on, again, in other countries, and we look at the EU as a really, really good model for this. The EU has used science-based methodologies to determine which countries can have access to the EU without quarantine. And so first they opened it up based on what they saw as the R0, the replication rate, having been under control in virtually all of the EU. They allowed EU countries between the second week of June and July 1st. And then as of July 1st, they've introduced a series of, I believe, about 15 other countries of the world, including Canada, who have a R0 under control. In other words, based on how they have controlled the virus, what is the replication rate based on 100,000 people over a 2-week time frame, and that means that Canadians can go there without quarantine, and that is a big driver. And that they recognize the importance of tourism. They recognize the importance of being able to do some level of business, and of course, if Canada did the same thing, then you'd have some Canadians who'd have confidence to go there and then come back into Canada without having to quarantine here. No one will go for a 2-week holiday and then have a 2-week quarantine here. No one will go for a 2-day business meeting and then have a 2-week quarantine here. So, governments need to thoughtfully open this. I think when the quarantine rules were put in, it was at that, in March, over 100 days ago, 120 days ago, at a time when we didn't know how this was going to get under control, and what was appropriate then needs to be proportionate now, because the consequences, again, for our business, for our 20,000 employees, for all of those spin-off businesses, we need to start being able to earn some revenue. And right now it is the government that is preventing us from doing that. Likewise, the provinces have imposed their own restrictions, and it's I would say at this stage totally inappropriate that a Canadian cannot go into all parts of Canada, and that affects some other carriers more directly than us that count entirely on domestic travel. We've seen like Porter is completely shut down, and WestJet is obviously extremely affected by it. These are carriers that depend on domestic Canadian travel, and so we still have in the Atlantic provinces, they've just opened up the so-called Atlantic bubble, but still prevent travel from other parts of Canada. There are still restrictions that apply into Manitoba, Northwest Territory. The three territories still have. So this is a multi-pronged dynamic where someone says if this industry is the driver of the economy that it is, we have to be much more thoughtful as to how to open it up, science-based, thoughtfully, and looking at models that have worked very well in other parts of the world.
So if the government decontrolled today and said there are no restrictions on you at all, anybody is free to fly wherever they want on Air Canada, the first question that passengers would have is, am I putting my health and my safety at risk by flying? How do you answer that? And what measures is Air Canada taking to ensure the safety of its employees and of its customers?
So since this March shutdown, airlines around the world working with the leading airline association, which is IATA, and in turn IATA working with ICAO, which is the global regulator of aviation, have started to put together a series of industry-wide measures that would, from a sanitization perspective, from a biosafety perspective, from a biosecurity perspective, that would enhance the safety of air travel. Air Canada, we were out in front of all of that. We knew that regulators would do some of that work, but we really didn't want to wait for that. So we started ourselves. We were the first carrier in the Americas to mandate temperature checks. We were one of the earliest carriers to mandate the wearing of masks on board the airplane and on the boarding process, ahead of Transport Canada, ahead of the international regulator. Likewise for the temperature check, ahead of Transport Canada. We've changed our sanitization process. We use this static cleaning methodology where you see like this spraying that goes on, which is a disinfectant that basically disinfects to the level of virtually all viruses that are known to exist. The HEPA filters, which are on board the aircraft, filter out 99.9% of all viruses, and this has been scientifically proven.
So
our crew
safer flying in terms of air quality than the typical office environment.
Oh, and there's no question that it's materially better. I mean, the expression that is often used is that it would be rank second to hospital quality sanitization, and that's really what the industry has sought to achieve. Obviously some carriers will move faster than others. We think we move pretty fast ourselves, but the industry itself is moving at that speed. And now the main regulator of aviation, international aviation, is ICAO, a UN body, and they've signed off on a series of protocols. EASA, which is the European regulator, has signed off on a series of protocols, also taking into account the ICAO initiatives. And now the FAA and Transport Canada are looking as to what other changes to make from those. So you'll have a series of standards, but we've already started implementing what we think are best practices. And in fact, we're going to be announcing today or tomorrow that we're also starting to do some pilot projects on rapid testing. We'll start first with our employees. I'm sure you're aware that there are a few companies, including one Canadian company, that is working on rapid COVID testing kits. So we're trying to be really at the cutting edge of this, recognizing that this biosafety dynamic is what is needed to get passengers on board the aircraft. And I know there's been a lot of controversy now about the middle seat and keeping the middle seat open or not. I mean, there's no way to have 6 feet social distancing on an airplane. You can't have it between passengers. Even if you eliminated that middle seat, you'd be eliminating 28 inches or 24 inches. Then you'd have to eliminate 6 feet in front, 6 feet in back, 6 feet on the side. It doesn't work on an airplane. So I think that what the regulators have concluded, and what we certainly believe, is that with all of these other biosafety and biosecurity measures, we are severely mitigating that risk. Crew is wearing masks, passengers are wearing masks, the food product has changed, the less touching of screens and touching of things. So while that goes on, we think that this is a mitigated environment, and passengers will gradually feel increasingly comfortable to start traveling again.
Final area that I want to touch on, I want to ask you to get out your crystal ball. And I realize that anything related to predictions where COVID-19 is concerned is a mug's game. But you obviously have to have planning assumptions in terms of when we'll see some degree of normalcy. When do you think that we are apt to see both global volumes and Canadian volumes returning to anywhere near where they were at the beginning of this year?
We've said obviously we're a publicly traded company, so I want to be careful not to say more than we've said in the public markets. But what we said as a estimate at the end of the first quarter, when we announced our first quarter results, we said that this would take a minimum of 3 years. We certainly are not more optimistic than that. There's no question in the airline industry, this will not be a V-shaped recovery. It'll be combined with all of the measures we've just finished talking about as to the gradual comfort level of passengers once they understand what some of these biosafety and biosecurity measures are. So that's one driver of it. Governments reinstating proper travel without quarantine, without restrictions, without travel advisories. People need to be able to travel and be able to buy insurance if in case of a problem, even unrelated to COVID-19. Any problem, people are not going to be inclined to travel unless they can get insurance. And so the government lifting these things is a big driver of that. That obviously is not, certainly not in Canada, has not occurred yet. It's occurring, more thoughtfully in other parts of the world. So that's a second driver. Thirdly, when we look at, we've always said that the domestic is going to recover first. Visiting family and friends, because people really want to go out there and see the people that they haven't seen now for 3 or 4 months. Visiting family and friends will be, the next driver of that, even if it's not just domestic. Then people will want to go on some holidays. They want to be able to maybe go to sun destinations and so on and so forth. And business travel will return more slowly. Domestic business travel, we've done a polling of our Aeroplan members, the people who travel most frequently, and about 60% of the most frequent travelers, those that are 50, who fly more than 50,000 miles a year, are saying that they definitely expect to take some business trips before the end of the year. 60%. So 60% is not a fantastic number, but it's not as bad a number as you see on some of the other polls where the general population says that they don't expect to take a trip until 2021. So we know that the rebuilding of this has got layers to it. And then, of course, because of the layoffs, by definition, there's going to be a rebuilding exercise. Airplanes are going to exit the fleet. We've announced that we're going to be exiting 79 aircraft, which is a large number of aircraft. As we exit 20,000 people, exit. So getting replacement aircraft then and hiring people. So this is why this is a multi-year transformation, and we do need to have, as part of this, a very, very strong collaboration with governments at all levels to understand what it takes to rebuild this industry that has been so cataclysmically affected by this event.
And then looking at the architecture of the industry, you mentioned that flying will probably start at the more local level and then ultimately internationally. As you look down the road at Air Canada, how do you see that changing the architecture of the company? Will you be more of a domestic airline and less international in terms of the balance between the two? Will you be more of a hub and spoke system as opposed to point within Canada? Or is that simply too far down the road for you to be able to?
No, well, no. We've had this amazing decade of success, and it would take a lot for me to scrap that philosophy. that philosophy was built around, largely around a network, a very, very powerful, compelling network that gave Canadians access to 220 destinations, which is unbelievable, punching well above our weight as a country with that kind of access. But at the same time, built international travel flows. And that's how we were able to give that access, by building these international travel flows, because you could never justify point-to-point traffic only with domestic Canadian traffic. In other words, when we start a route to Tokyo from Montreal, you can't justify a daily service to Tokyo from Montreal based on Montreal only traffic. Impossible, right? So, and that's the same for Shanghai and for all of these other markets that we built. And often we'd have, multiple, we would, serve Shanghai from Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver daily. So, to do that, you have to count on connecting traffic. And that strategy, that vision, I would say, is still very, very much a part of Air Canada's long-term perspective. We have to be strong internationally. We also have to have a strong domestic backbone. It's possible that the international side will be challenged for some period of time until there's a vaccine. But I think that, following a vaccine, I don't see any reason why we would not return to that level of international activity. So there's no question that we'll see, for example, in the summer of 2021 and the summer of 2022, we will see fewer international destinations served directly from Canada than we did before. We will probably do more connecting over our conventional hubs. For example, in Europe, we have our partner Lufthansa, that we built our European hubs over the Lufthansa hubs, Frankfurt, Munich, Zurich, and so on. And so you'll see more of that, as opposed to some of those direct connecting flights to some of the other places that we'd opened up over the last few years. But that I would view as largely temporary until the vaccine, and then we'd expect to kind of get back to where we were. We also counted a lot on U.S. traffic. Air Canada is the largest foreign carrier in the United States of America, which is a big statement considering there's so many powerful carriers out there. We serve 53 cities with multiple, flights every single day. And the U.S., of course, right now, the U.S. is having its challenges, and we know that, and we're virtually not operating. We're operating a handful of routes right now into the States. But assuming that the United States gets back on its feet, we would expect the U.S. to continue to be a big part of this picture. So I'd say that this is largely, it's a retooling with some aircraft exiting the fleet, the older exiting the fleet, and we'll take new aircraft back in. We'll have to rehire when the time comes. But I don't see the long-term vision of Air Canada being a global carrier with 3 very, very compelling global gateways, with a backbone of a domestic and transborder backbone serving, of course, virtually all of the destinations we served before, subject to some tweaking and some reductions, as you saw, as we announced last week, in terms of the regional networks. We could see other reductions in our network as well as we pare down over for the next 3 years.
Well, a fascinating conversation that could go on much longer. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for your candor. These are turbulent times for air travel, not just in Canada, but around the world. And we're very fortunate to have such a steady hand in the pilot seat at Air Canada.
Thank you very much, Perrin. I really appreciated the opportunity.